Brett Theodos. He is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Community Economic Development Hub. That's at the Urban Institute. He has been the co-author of the latest policy focus, A New Era of Racial Equity in Community Development Finance. Brett, it's a fascinating read, and of course, much of it is about the sheer scale of money contributed via philanthropic institutions or private institutions after the death of George Floyd. And we all know that it's very sad that a natural human had to die to inspire this sort of giving, not just him, but many more before that. But the focus is on tackling racial barriers, promoting racial equity. What's the sort of scale that we're talking of here, the size of commitments?
We're talking about in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which is an appreciable commitment that we haven't seen in this way in this timing from this sector.
215 billion from private and philanthropic sectors. Part of that is going to go into community development and the financing thereof. How are you going to align with the actual needs, do you think? This is what the whole research is about, this particular focus of yours, is the types of capital, the types of institutions. They're going to ensure that, look, this money is spent wisely.
Alignment is hard, always. There's a lot of actors making a lot of decisions, and some have different motivations. Some are trying to give back to their hometown, to where they have a local presence, and some are thinking much more broadly across places. But the key goal is not just to deliver resources, but do so in a way that builds up capacity and leaves a lasting legacy behind, so that the money is more than just today, but actually builds something for tomorrow as well.
And what's the role of the federal government in all of this?
The role of the federal government is key. It is larger than philanthropic investments, as we've seen from recent stimulus bills. It's outsized, and it can take greater risks. It can add money in places that even philanthropic capital is not really going.
Okay, interesting. And I'm sort of interested in also how you ensure that this is aligned, spent wisely, but that communities that are involved, the people set to benefit here, are aligned with it as well, that they can put the money to work, that they can actually show the federal government or indeed the private institutions, the philanthropic endeavors that are giving them the capital, that this is the right place to be putting it.
There are relatively few mechanisms for direct resident or neighborhood control or influence about how federal resources are spent. States usually have a role depending on the particular subsidy and program that we're talking about, given the federal structure of the US. That more rarely will go to mayors or cities that have some decision-making authority. Neighborhood groups or neighborhood residents rarely have input into those processes.
Can that be improved, do you think?
I think there are mechanisms and there are ways, and some programs do better than others. But it would take a real sea change in how we structure policy and decision making.
So with that in mind, the fact that perhaps you're not able to ensure that the people who are directly being, we hope, helped, that will be alleviated through the reduction in racial barriers are getting an input, how do you measure the impact? How do you ensure that this money is being spent in the right place and the effects of it?
So we're doing this for a range of programs. And the first step is, where's the money go? So what's the poverty rate or the income level or the racial composition, or how rural versus urban is the funding going? And so we can look at that across the country. Step one. Step two, let's look at who institutionally are these actors that are getting in the investments, and are they building up in a way that they have the potential to give back and to be an anchor locally over the longer term. And then step three is, what are those long-term benefits? Can we see poverty rates going down? Can we see incomes going up? Can we see that there's real material change, new firm creation, new jobs in these communities?
Are you optimistic that this wall of money, 215 billion, will be long-lasting, that the commitment will be there, that we don't just turn off the taps after this one horrific event, that the money can be in some way built into the business models of some of the private sectors that are giving?
I hope so. I hope so. On the corporate side especially, I think there is a desire for corporations to be seen as responsible stewards in communities. That said, that giving relative to the size of balance sheets or of corporations, or even relative to the size of donor advised funds or traditional philanthropy outlets, there's a lot more money out there that hasn't yet been invested. And so we're going to need to sustain that commitment and then some to see measurable change in communities. So the hope is this is not a one-time moment that's a passing fad.
Here's hoping. And just can you give us some practical advice of or examples of how already that money is being put to work to in some way alleviate racial barriers, whether that be in housing, whether that be in education, whether that be in, funding for certain parts of a community? How are we already seeing it deployed?
It really is all over the place, but some examples are things like money that can go to be credit enhancement or a loan loss reserve, money that can de-risk lending. And so you can bring together private capital money and you can actually take greater risks if you're adding some other money that can add as the protection or the buffer in case things go wrong. But there's all other sorts of examples, direct subsidy, human services, outreach and advocacy work, direct health and food and housing support, education and workforce. It really covers the full range.
And of that 215 billion, how much do you think is currently being spent wisely?
It is so hard to say, in part because these initiatives are not subjecting themselves necessarily to rigorous metrics, to rigorous tracking, to rigorous disclosure. It's actually quite difficult to track down what is truly new and additive, what is done differently, by whom and where. So it can sometimes be hard to get this information out of the federal government, the public sector. It is all the harder to get it out of reading between the press release lines of the corporate sector.
Brett Theodos, it's really great to get your expertise. It's a fascinating read. I urge people to go and download A New Era of Racial Equity in Community Development Finance. Of course, you are Senior Fellow and indeed the Director of the Community Economic Development Hub over at the Urban Institute. Thank you so much for your time.